Chapter 1. Silence before the collapse. She lived by rhythm, a pattern as reliable as the ticking of a clock. Each day carried its repetitions. Meals, the measured pricks of the needle, the quiet reassurance of the vials waiting in the refrigerator. For years she had trusted those vials without hesitation, believing that order and consistency meant safety. The home around her, familiar and steady, felt like a sanctuary. It had always been the one place where she could lower her guard. But that day, the sense of safety crumbled into something unrecognizable. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A faint tremor ran through her fingers as she reached for a glass, and she told herself it was nothing. Yet the tremor refused to fade. It deepened, shaking the glass against the countertop, rattling through her muscles as though some unseen current had taken control. A damp chill spread across her skin, first on her palms, then the back of her neck, until her entire body was cloaked in cold sweat. She tried to dismiss it as fatigue or nerves, but her body was delivering a message she could not ignore. The room shifted around her. Shapes blurred, edges dissolved, and the air thickened as if she were moving through water. The walls appeared farther away than they were, stretching into a haze of light and shadow. She blinked repeatedly, trying to bring the world back into focus, but each attempt left her vision foggier. Her heart pounded with a frantic rhythm, first too fast, then suddenly sluggish, each beat uneven, as if her body could not decide whether to race toward survival or surrender to collapse. She recognized the signs even through the confusion. Her training, her knowledge, and the countless hours of monitoring her health left no room for doubt. This was hypoglycemia, a dangerous plunge into blood sugar levels so low that consciousness itself began to slip away. But the recognition only magnified the terror. She was not diabetic. She should not have been falling like this, not without reason. And that realization tore through her like a blade. Something had gone wrong, not by accident, but by interference. The floor felt unstable beneath her feet, shifting and swaying with every step. She leaned against the wall, her fingertips dragging along the paint as she tried to steady herself. Each breath came shallow and rapid, never quite satisfying, leaving her lungs aching for more. The sounds of the house, distant traffic, a faint hum of the refrigerator, grew louder, distorted, as though the world around her were mocking her weakness. Her thoughts slowed, clumsy and disorganized, fragments breaking apart before they could fully form. Time unraveled into a blur of moments, each one heavier than the last. Seconds stretched into eternities, and the line between wakefulness and unconsciousness grew dangerously thin. She tried to reach for the counter where a small carton of juice waited, her lifeline, but her hands betrayed her. Fingers slipped clumsily, knocking over an object that clattered to the floor, echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the room. Her body seemed foreign, disconnected from her will, as if she were observing her own collapse from somewhere outside herself. Then came the sound. A piercing alarm, shrill and urgent, cut through the haze like a blade. The blood sugar monitor, strapped against her skin, screamed in protest against the plummeting numbers. The device she had once considered a precaution, a tool she hardly needed, had transformed into her only ally. Its unrelenting signal jolted her with a surge of clarity. Act now, or disappear into the black void gathering at the edges of her vision. She forced her body into motion. Crawling, staggering, clutching at furniture, she reached the table. Her hand wrapped around the juice box with the desperation of someone clinging to a rope above an abyss. She tore it open, lips trembling as she forced the liquid down. The sweetness filled her mouth, syrupy and overwhelming, but it was life disguised as taste. Each swallow fought against the darkness pressing in, each drop clawing back seconds of consciousness. She collapsed against the wall, the juice carton still in her hand, her chest heaving with uneven breaths. Her heart thundered in her ears, slowing gradually as the sugar began its work. The cold sweat soaked through her shirt, leaving her shivering in the aftermath of survival. The fog in her mind lifted only slightly, just enough to register what had nearly happened. Relief should have come, but in its place bloomed something darker. It was not a mistake. That thought anchored itself, unshakable, undeniable. Hypoglycemia did not strike without cause. Not like this, not with such violence. Somewhere between the trust she had given to her home and the reliance on the vials she had injected, a betrayal had taken root. Someone had tampered with her lifeline, replacing security with peril. As she sat there, drained and trembling, her body recovering inch by inch, the truth pressed against her ribs like a stone she could not swallow. The sanctuary she had trusted was no longer safe. The routine she had followed so faithfully had been corrupted. And now she knew, with absolute certainty, that what had happened was not random chance. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was an attempt to erase her existence in silence. Chapter 2. Traces in the details. The memory of the sudden collapse refused to fade. Even as her body slowly recovered its strength, her mind circled back to that terrifying hour, dissecting every second as though hidden answers might surface if she stared hard enough. Sleep brought no peace. Instead, she awoke with a racing heart and a lingering sense of danger. The ordinary rhythms of her days now felt fragile, like glass underfoot. Every glance at the refrigerator where the vials rested sent a shiver through her. One morning, when the apartment was quiet, and only the low hum of the fridge filled the silence, she stood before the shelves and let her eyes travel across the lined rows. She had seen those bottles countless times, always arranged with careful precision. But something now felt off. It was small, barely noticeable. One cap leaned ever so slightly, not aligned with the rest, as if it had been opened and closed by someone unfamiliar with her careful routine. She reached for it, hands steady, but pulse quickening. The cap resisted just enough to suggest it had been tampered with recently. The smooth plastic felt wrong under her fingertips, too loosely fitted. She set it back in place, then pulled out the carton holding spare ampules. That was when the inconsistencies began to speak more loudly. She studied the expiration dates printed on the labels. Some matched her last pharmacy purchase, the ones she clearly remembered unpacking. Others were newer, dated weeks beyond what she had ever received. It was subtle enough that an untrained eye would not have noticed, but her memory was sharp when it came to these details. She had counted them, checked them, arranged them. At first glance, the vials looked ordinary, rows of identical clear liquid sealed in glass. Yet her instincts would not let her rest. She knew the familiar appearance of insulin, a certain viscosity, the faint sheen that caught the light at the right angle, the way it clung just slightly to the glass. Lifting one vial closer to her eyes, she tilted it gently back and forth. The liquid inside moved with unnatural ease, too thin, too light, lacking the faint cloudiness she expected. It gleamed like pure water, reflecting nothing but the stark light of the kitchen. Her chest tightened as she held the vial against the window where daylight streamed through. The sunlight passed through it in a way that seemed too transparent, too pure. She placed it down, then pulled another from deeper in the carton. This one, too, betrayed the same sterile clarity. A creeping dread spread through her, not because the evidence was obvious, but because it hid beneath the surface in the tiniest details, the kind of details no one but she would bother to examine. She lined several vials on the counter, arranging them side by side. Slowly she compared them, twisting each to examine the printed lot numbers. Some matched, others carried different sequences entirely. She knew how pharmacies rotated stock, how manufacturers packaged consistent runs. This mismatch told a story, one that whispered of intrusion, of hands that did not belong in her medicine. The refrigerator door hung open behind her as she continued her inspection. Cold air spilled across her arms, but she barely noticed. Her mind ran through the possibilities. Could the pharmacy have made a mistake? Could there have been a mix-up in packaging? She knew better. The boxes had been sealed when she first opened them, and she remembered the receipts with precise dates. Every inconsistency pointed not outward, but inward, to this very home. Her thoughts slowed as fear gave way to method. She became deliberate, cautious, cataloging every anomaly as though building a case. She noted the tilt of the cap, the mismatched lot codes, the unnatural clarity of the liquid. Each fact settled like a stone, heavy but undeniable. Together they formed a pattern too precise to dismiss. Her breath fogged against the glass of the vial she still held, a reminder of her presence in the quiet room. She placed it down carefully, as though the object might shatter not physically, but in the weight of its truth. The idea pressed harder against her mind. The vials had been altered, not by chance, but by intention. Someone had replaced what should have saved her life with something incapable of sustaining it. The silence of the kitchen grew oppressive, wrapping around her as she closed the refrigerator door and stood staring at the counter. The ordinary world of labels and clear liquid had transformed into evidence of sabotage. What had once been symbols of safety now looked like weapons disguised as medicine. Her body remembered the trembling collapse, the cold sweat, the suffocating haze. She connected those sensations to what now sat in front of her. The answer had been there all along, waiting for her to notice the wrongness in the smallest detail. The attack had not been an accident of biology, but a deliberate interference carried out through the very object she had trusted most. As she gathered the vials back into their carton, her movements grew slower, heavier, each one weighed down by the realization that her sanctuary had been breached. She could not yet see the face of the intruder, but she could trace their presence in the faintest signs: a tilted cap, a mismatched number, a liquid too clear to belong. And in that moment, she understood that the truth had been whispering to her all along, hidden in the details others would overlook. It was only because she knew the rhythm of her life so intimately, because she trusted memory and instinct, that she could see the fracture lines. The attack was not loud or obvious. It lived in the quiet, in the subtleties, in the almost invisible signs of intrusion. She set the carton back inside the refrigerator, but the sense of violation lingered. Nothing would look the same again. The silence that once meant peace now carried the weight of suspicion, and every glance at those vials reminded her that her world had already begun to collapse. Not with noise, but with the quiet betrayal of details too clean, too perfect, too wrong. Chapter 3. Stepmother and Her Shadow. At first she tried to convince herself that she was imagining things. Stress could make details loom larger than they were, and fear had a way of twisting harmless gestures into sinister shapes. But the coincidences multiplied, until they no longer looked like coincidences at all. They began to align into a pattern, each fragment linking to the next, each memory reshaping itself with darker meaning. Her stepmother had always cloaked herself in the language of care. She emphasized her attentiveness at every opportunity, reminding others how devoted she was, how she stepped in when needed. She often made small comments about wanting to help with the injections, offering in tones that seemed warm, yet always unnecessary. The words were delivered with a smile, but behind the smile lurked an insistence that carried more weight than kindness. She had no reason to assist, yet she positioned herself near every part of the process, hovering like a shadow. The kitchen became the stage for these subtle intrusions. Whenever she prepared her medicine, the stepmother lingered nearby, finding reasons to stay. Sometimes she rearranged dishes. Sometimes she wiped down a counter that was already clean. Always present, never far. Her movements appeared casual, but felt intrusive. The rhythm of preparing vials, needles, and alcohol swabs was supposed to be private, precise. But under that constant watch, it became something else. The air thickened with the presence of another pair of eyes, watching, waiting. A memory rose unbidden, one she had dismissed at the time as a thoughtless remark. She had been standing by the counter, organizing supplies, when the stepmother chuckled and said she trusted those bottles too much. The words had floated past like a breeze then, harmless and vague. But revisited now, under the weight of recent revelations, the comment sounded different. It was not playful, not careless, but edged with something colder. Trust was exactly what had been shattered. Trust was the very weapon being used against her. The stepmother's demeanor had always been polished, carefully constructed. She wore gentleness like armor, smiling easily, offering reassurances, positioning herself as the dependable presence in the household. To outsiders, she seemed the model of composure, a woman committed to nurturing and order. But that very composure now appeared staged, a mask designed to conceal something calculated. Each carefully chosen word, each orchestrated act of kindness, looked different under the harsh light of suspicion. Replaying moments from the past, she saw new patterns emerging. The times the stepmother insisted on storing groceries for her, slipping into the refrigerator as though it belonged to her alone. The afternoons when she entered the kitchen just as the medication was being prepared, her hands busy with excuses but her eyes never leaving the vials. The frequent questions about dosage, phrased as concern, but too persistent, too pointed, as though gathering information rather than expressing care. Her body recalled the collapse, the dizziness, the tremor in her limbs. She tied that memory to the image of the stepmother leaning casually against the counter, smiling as she asked unnecessary questions about injections. The two scenes blurred together until the smile itself became sinister. What had once looked like involvement now felt like intrusion. What had sounded like care now echoed as warning. The household routines began to feel contaminated. She walked into the kitchen and sensed an invisible residue, a reminder that every surface might have been touched with intent. The refrigerator door handle carried a new heaviness in her grip, as though each time she opened it, she was reaching into a space her stepmother had already claimed. Even ordinary objects, measuring cups, dish towels, the hum of the appliance, took on new associations, all colored by the constant presence of someone who should not have been there. Her perception of her stepmother fractured. The soft smiles and measured tones became performances, layers of disguise covering motives she could no longer ignore. Every memory sharpened into evidence, every shared moment reframed as part of a larger scheme. The image of a caregiver crumbled to reveal something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous beneath. Sitting alone in her room, she tried to remember when the transformation had begun. Had her stepmother always carried this hidden edge? Or had it grown slowly, woven into daily life until it became nearly invisible? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but one truth rose above all others. Behind the veil of tenderness lived a shadow, and that shadow had reached into her most private sanctuary. The unease grew into certainty. The gestures of help were not neutral. The lingering presence was not incidental. The words spoken in jest had been warnings disguised as humor. Her stepmother's mask of kindness no longer held its shape, and through the cracks, she glimpsed the outlines of a dangerous game. The realization settled in her bones with a finality she could not shake. She was no longer dealing with accidents or coincidences. She was standing across from a figure who had played at care while plotting harm, whose gentle hands carried the weight of betrayal. The shadow of her stepmother stretched across every part of her life, and the light that once made her feel safe now revealed the depth of its darkness. Chapter 4. Verification of the truth. She knew that suspicion alone was not enough. Fear could distort memory, could amplify small irregularities until they became overwhelming. But fear did not prove anything. What she needed was certainty, something beyond instinct and recollection. If she was wrong, then the terror she carried each day was only the echo of anxiety. But if she was right, the consequences were darker than anything she had ever imagined. That question became the weight she could no longer bear. The decision to test the vial grew slowly, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface, pressing harder each day. She chose carefully, selecting one bottle that appeared most suspicious, the one with the cap that sat crooked, the one whose liquid gleamed too transparently under the light. She held it for a long time before leaving the house, her hand curled around the cold glass, as though it contained not medicine, but the truth itself. The walk to the laboratory felt longer than usual. Every step echoed with a rising awareness that her life had already changed. The city moved around her in its normal rhythm. Cars rushing past, conversation spilling from open windows, the smell of bread from a bakery nearby. But none of it reached her. She walked within a bubble of silence, the vial in her bag a silent companion that throbbed with significance. The laboratory was plain and unremarkable, a place she had passed countless times without thought. Now it felt like a courtroom, the site where judgment would be delivered. She met the eyes of a nurse she knew distantly, someone who had always been polite in passing. Explaining her request required effort. The words emerged heavy, halting, a simple explanation that she suspected tampering and needed analysis. The nurse nodded, professional and discreet, and accepted the vial with calm hands. The waiting stretched into an eternity. She sat alone in a small consultation room, staring at the pale walls and listening to the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Every minute deepened her dread. She replayed the steps of her daily routines, searching for overlooked details. She imagined the nurse handling the vial, the fluid sliding into syringes, the machines that would measure its contents with precision. She thought of what those machines might reveal, and with each thought, her pulse raced faster. When the door finally opened, the air in the room shifted. The nurse returned without words, only with a thin sheet of paper folded in her hand. Her eyes met hers briefly, and in that gaze was an entire story. No hesitation, no ambiguity, only the quiet weight of certainty. The paper was offered across the table, and she accepted it with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to remain steady. She unfolded the page and read the lines, her eyes moving quickly though her mind resisted the meaning. The fluid was not insulin. The report described it clearly. Stripped of emotion. Saline solution. Sterile but empty. Incapable of lowering blood sugar. Incapable of sustaining life for someone dependent on medication. Her chest constricted as though a band had tightened around her ribs. The words blurred before her eyes, but she forced herself to read them again and again, until there was no possibility of misinterpretation. This was not a clerical error. It was not a mistake at the pharmacy. Someone had deliberately placed these bottles in her care, knowing what they were, knowing what they would do. She sat in the stillness of the consultation room, the paper clenched in her lap. The world outside that sterile chamber no longer felt real. The laughter of children passing in the hallway, the distant ringing of a telephone, the steady rhythm of footsteps, all of it seemed detached, belonging to a reality that had moved on without her. Her reality had contracted into this moment, this single confirmation that her fear had been justified. The report cut through every fragile denial she had built. It was no longer possible to convince herself that her imagination had exaggerated, that her anxiety had twisted facts. Here, in black ink, was the unarguable evidence that someone living under her roof had tried to replace life with emptiness, hope with silence. It was not the disease she had to fear, but the betrayal of a human hand. Her mind struggled to contain the enormity of it. The implications swarmed her thoughts, sharp and relentless. This meant intent, not accident. It meant planning, access, deliberate manipulation of something meant to keep her alive. Each of those conclusions settled heavily upon her, reshaping her understanding of the home she lived in, the people she trusted, the world she thought she knew. The paper crumpled slightly beneath her tightening grip, edges bending under the pressure of her fingers. She tried to breathe evenly, but each inhale scraped against the panic rising within her. She pressed her back against the cold chair, staring at the ceiling as though answers might be written there. All she found was the silence of fluorescent lights and the pounding of her own heart. It was true. She was not mistaken. The attack had been real, not imagined. And now that truth lived in her hands, undeniable and devastating. The mask of ordinary life had been ripped away, leaving behind the raw knowledge that someone close, someone inside her home, had prepared her death with the quiet precision of an unseen hand. Chapter 5. The Trap for the Betrayer. She understood that confronting her stepmother directly would achieve nothing. The woman had built her life around appearances, mastering the art of charm and gentle authority. To her father, she was a source of comfort. To neighbors, she was a model of generosity, and to outsiders, she radiated kindness. Any accusation without proof would collapse beneath the weight of that carefully crafted image. It would become her word against a smile polished to perfection. The battle had to be fought differently. She began preparing in silence, moving with the caution of someone walking across thin ice. Her plan was simple in form, but complex in execution. Let the truth reveal itself. She studied the kitchen first, tracing where the small camera could be placed without detection. The corners above the cabinets, the shadowed space beside the spice rack, the narrow shelf where an unused cookbook collected dust. Each spot offered potential. After careful testing, she chose the angle that captured the refrigerator clearly, the place where every vial was stored and every intrusion had occurred. The installation felt both empowering and chilling. As she secured the device, she was struck by the strangeness of surveilling her own home. The act turned her kitchen from a place of meals and routine into a stage set for betrayal. The blinking indicator light, concealed by a strip of tape, became her ally, a silent witness waiting for the curtain to rise on the performance she suspected. Next came the preparation of the vials. She marked them in ways so discreet that no untrained eye would notice. Tiny scratches beneath the labels, microscopic dots made with a needle, subtle variations in placement, all invisible under casual inspection, but clear to her. Each vial became both medicine and bait, waiting for the moment when unfamiliar hands would disturb their order. She placed them neatly back into the carton, arranging them with the same care she always used, then slid the box into its usual spot on the refrigerator shelf. Once everything was ready, she forced herself into patience. The waiting proved harder than the planning. Each time she entered the kitchen, her heart raced at the thought of discovery. Every glance at the refrigerator made her stomach tighten. Yet she maintained her outward calm, interacting with her stepmother as though nothing had changed. She responded politely to questions, endured the hovering presence during meal preparation, and pretended not to notice when her stepmother lingered by the counter longer than necessary. Days passed before the moment arrived. She had grown almost accustomed to the tension, living in a constant state of anticipation, when the recording finally captured what she had feared. The image appeared clear on her screen when she reviewed the footage alone late at night. There was the stepmother, entering the kitchen with the quiet assurance of someone who believed herself unobserved. She moved to the refrigerator, opened the door with casual ease, and reached for the carton. The recording showed everything. The stepmother's hand selecting one of the marked vials, slipping it quickly into a pocket. Then, from her handbag, she produced another vial. The switch was smooth, practiced, and deliberate. The false vial was placed into the carton as though nothing had changed. The refrigerator door closed, and with it, the act of sabotage was complete. The simplicity of the gesture stunned her more than its boldness. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her stepmother's movements. It was routine, as if this act had been repeated before. The evidence was undeniable. The trap had sprung, and the shadow that had haunted her every suspicion was now visible in the cold clarity of video. She replayed the footage again and again, each viewing both strengthening and shattering her. The images carried no ambiguity. It was not paranoia, not imagination, not the twisted fear of an anxious mind. It was proof, captured frame by frame. Her sanctuary had been invaded, her life endangered, and now the betrayer stood revealed by her own actions. Holding her laptop in trembling hands, she felt both relief and dread. Relief that she was not losing her mind, that her instincts had been right all along. Dread because the evidence did not simply confirm betrayal. It confirmed intent, the conscious decision to replace life-saving medicine with emptiness. The trap had worked. Yet victory felt hollow. The recording did not erase the fear that had seeped into her bones, nor did it restore the trust that had been destroyed. Instead, it delivered a heavier truth. She lived with someone who had tried to erase her existence quietly, efficiently, without hesitation. She closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, the glow of the screen fading but the weight of what she had witnessed settling more firmly. The camera had captured what words never could. The façade of care was gone, replaced by the stark reality of malice carried out in silence. The evidence existed now, undeniable and unalterable. It was no longer her suspicion but her stepmother's own actions, preserved in digital memory, waiting to expose the truth to anyone who doubted. The mask had cracked, and behind it lay the face of someone willing to destroy her, all while smiling softly at the world. Chapter 6. Trial and Retribution. The moment she handed the recording and the laboratory report to the police, the fragile illusion her stepmother had lived behind began to fracture. The woman who had always maintained composure, who had perfected the role of caregiver, finally revealed the cracks in her performance. At the sight of undeniable evidence, her face stiffened into a mask of panic disguised as calm. The veneer of control faltered, leaving behind a grimace that betrayed both fear and anger. It was the first time the mask had slipped, and in that slip the truth shone through. The investigation unfolded with a steady momentum, propelled by the weight of evidence that could not be explained away. The vial filled with saline, the laboratory analysis, the camera footage capturing the switch inside the kitchen. All of it formed a chain of proof too strong to break. The police asked questions, documented details, and moved forward with a clinical efficiency that left no space for denial. Her stepmother attempted explanations, insisting it had been a misunderstanding, claiming intentions of harmlessness. But each claim fell flat against the clarity of the images and the cold precision of the laboratory results. When the trial began, the courtroom became the stage where appearances finally meant nothing. The woman who once thrived on reputation, who carefully cultivated her image before neighbors and friends, sat in silence beneath the harsh gaze of law. No charm could soften the evidence projected on the screen. No gentle tone could erase the images of her hand replacing life-saving medicine with a vial of water. For once, her words were stripped of their power. The prosecution presented the case with relentless force. Every detail was laid out before the court: the timeline of events, the suspicious inconsistencies in the vials, the collapse that nearly ended a life, the analysis proving substitution, and finally the video evidence showing the act itself. Each fact struck like a hammer against stone, breaking apart any defense she might have offered. The rhythm of the prosecutor's words echoed in the courtroom, heavy and decisive, as though each sentence was a nail sealing the coffin of her defense. She sat through it all, her own body stiff with tension, her hands clenched tightly together. It was not triumph she felt, but a deep weariness, the kind that seeped into her bones. She had not sought revenge. She had sought safety, clarity, and truth. Yet the truth, once revealed, carried its own weight. The person she had shared her home with, the one who had smiled with counterfeit warmth and spoken in tones of care, had acted with deliberate cruelty. That knowledge would never fade, no matter the outcome of the trial. Her stepmother, once so adept at presenting herself as composed, now sat with her head lowered. The lines of her face, always carefully arranged in polite expressions, had collapsed into something unguarded. The mask no longer existed. She looked small against the severity of the courtroom, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the floor. Every statement from the prosecution seemed to press her further down, each piece of evidence stripping away another layer of defense until there was nothing left but silence. Witnesses were called, professionals who confirmed the nature of the solution in the vials, experts who explained the dangers of insulin tampering, investigators who described how the camera footage had been collected and verified. Their testimonies aligned seamlessly, weaving a net from which no escape was possible. The defense attempted half-hearted strategies, pointing toward confusion, misunderstanding, or misplaced intention. Yet these arguments dissolved in the face of overwhelming proof. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier as the days stretched on. Each session felt less like a battle and more like a slow march toward an inevitable conclusion. The evidence formed an unbroken chain, and with every link the picture became clearer. It was not a matter of doubt anymore. It was a matter of formality, of following the process that would officially declare what everyone already understood. For her, sitting there and listening, the experience was not one of victory. Relief did not come easily. The reality that someone so close had calculated her erasure pressed against her chest like a weight she could not set down. Even as justice unfolded before her eyes, she carried the hollow recognition that safety had been broken long before the trial began. The system might deliver judgment, but the betrayal was permanent. When the verdict approached, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The silence before the announcement stretched thin, filled with the collective anticipation of every person present. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to savor the outcome but to prepare herself for its finality. When the words were spoken, decisive and unambiguous, they landed not as a cause for celebration, but as confirmation of a reality she had already lived. Her stepmother did not protest. She did not weep or beg. She sat motionless, her head still bowed, the mask of composure fully gone. In that stillness, there was no care, no pretense of affection, no disguises left. The woman revealed herself not through words but through the absence of them, through the void where performance had once lived. For her, it ended not with triumph, but with a weary exhale. The sound of the monitor's alarm, the piercing signal that had saved her life, echoed in her memory. That sound had been the barrier between life and silence, between survival and erasure. It reminded her that the truth, once uncovered, was not victory, but exposure. She had wanted only protection and confirmation of her fears, but what she received was heavier. The knowledge that betrayal had lived under her roof, and that survival came not from trust, but from vigilance and the sound of a machine that refused to let her slip away.